I'm joined by two of Britain's most respected economists. Roger Bootle is Managing Director of Capital Economics and a Specialist Advisor to the Treasury Select Committee. With him is Robert Skidelsky, Emeritus Professor of Economics at Warwick University. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for coming on the programme. Robert, let me start with you then. You were opposed to the deficit reduction plan pretty much from the beginning. You wanted more stimulus over austerity. Why?
Why? Because I didn't think that when the private sector was increasing its spending less, the government should be doing the same thing. I thought that that road would simply lead to a progressive reduction in aggregate demand, which was already deficient, and therefore would not lead to growth, but would lead to the opposite of growth. And I think that has turned out to be the case. I think at one time people bought the story that if you cut the deficit, then you would get automatic recovery. We now know that story was wrong. That was the story, I think, the Chancellor told in June 2010. And it's turned out to be incorrect. And I thought it was incorrect because I'm a Keynesian, and therefore I never believed in the fantasy of what was called expansionary fiscal contraction.
Okay, so Roger, where do you stand on this? Is the weak recovery in the UK basically down to austerity?
I'm a Keynesian too, by the way, although we disagree, I think, at the margins.
Yes.
I think the Chancellor's really in a nearly impossible position. The weak recovery, I think, would have happened without the global turmoil, actually, because I very much agree with what Lord Skidelsky has just said, that you were never going to have an expansionary contraction. That was, frankly, for the birds. However, I do think that the government has played a blinder with regard to achieving the rating in the markets that has been achieved, and that needs to be preserved. But this is the sense in which I have a limit to my Keynesianism. That's to say, I don't think you can just spend willy-nilly, because if you were to do that, the bond markets would take fright.
Yes,
well,
yes, what do you make of that?
I completely agree. Confidence is very important, but confidence is a very mysterious thing, and I don't think confidence in government finances can be sustained unless they're separate from economic performance.
Right.
And I think what gave confidence was the belief for a time that austerity would generate growth. Now, with the collapse of that belief, I don't think we can assume that the markets will be as willing to lend so cheaply to the British government as they have over this period, the recent period. So I see, we're not immune from the bond markets as they move from one country to another.
Well, so then let me put that to you, Roger. Do you think that how difficult is it going to be to preserve the position of the UK in the markets right now, as you say?
Well, I think it's very fragile. You can try to do the right thing, and hopefully it'll work out all right. But you can't be absolutely confident as quite how the market psychology is going to evolve. Now, I think there's scope for a bit more action, actually, from the Chancellor. And right from the beginning, I thought his programme for tightening was a bit too front-loaded. I'd have pushed it back a bit in time. I think the confidence of the markets could have been held with that sort of change. And I think now, for instance, the sort of programme that's being talked about of big infrastructure investment, I think that could be done without unsettling the markets. I even think there's scope for a bit more government spending on infrastructure. It's possible that if the Eurozone implodes, and I think it is going to implode, that far from it being a battle to maintain credibility in the markets, the UK is going to be seen as a safe haven. Now, if that happens, I think the danger is that the pound goes up on the exchanges, which would be, I think, very damaging. So
a number of different factors to take into consideration, Lord Skidelsky. Where do you stand on that? I'm curious, is there a limit to your Keynesianism in terms of, yes, you need to spend, but as Roger says, there has to be a limit on it in order to preserve your credibility in the markets?
Well, you have to be clever. You can't just be crude. I mean, when confidence is so important, you have to judge what mix is going to keep confidence. But there is a basic economic idea behind this. If you are engaged in policies that reduce aggregate demand, reduce spending, total spending in the economy, you will not retain the confidence of the markets. So the criterion, I think, has got to be whether the Chancellor's announcements, which we expect, what effect will they have on total spending in the economy? I think from what's been trailed, they're a step in the right direction. and he realizes that something else is needed. Whether you call it Plan B or Plan A plus or whatever, he realizes that the existing mixture, the existing policy isn't bringing about recovery, so he's going to try something else.
How much scope does he have, as Roger is saying, how much room to manoeuvre in terms of infrastructure investment spending?
Well, I think he's got more room to manoeuvre than we see. I don't know what effect these policies are going to have on total spending. We don't know how much new money is being committed. We don't know what effect the incentives and guarantees is going to have on private spend, the willingness of the private sector to invest. Those figures are simply plucked out of the air at the moment. 20 billion, 5 billion, interest rates down by 1% for small businesses and so on. All of that's vague. And what this amounts to is that the government doesn't have control over those variables unless it spends the money itself.
So what do you make of that, Roger? Does more spending also mean higher deficits?
Well, not necessarily. It depends who's doing the spending, of course. I think the key thing here is that large parts of the private sector, the corporate sector, are in good financial shape. Large British corporates, on the whole, have got pretty strong balance sheets. They are in a position to expand their investment spending if they can be made to want to do that. This is, I think, the big trick the government's got to pull off, with a bit of public money re-energising the private sector. Now, unfortunately, I think what's happened over the last few months is the civil servants have been sent rushing around in ever-decreasing circles in order to fulfil what they see as the chief objective, and that is to produce a statement today that's got all sorts of fine-sounding sound bites in it. Now, what should have happened, and this is where I very much agree with Lord Skidelsky, is that when they first came to power, that's when they should have been thinking about what the projects are that could boost demand, and they didn't, I think largely because they believed in this silly doctrine of expansionary fiscal contraction.
Let me then start to get your final thoughts. Lord Skidelsky, right now we're in a situation where growth in the UK has been pretty much flat for a year. I was just talking with Richard Lambert a little bit earlier on in the programme. He's saying, look, the thing that is really worrying me is the fact that productivity, domestic productivity, is so low. Now, why is this the case? Unemployment is at a 15-year high. Much of that is concentrated amongst the youth. What is the single most effective thing the government can do at this point?
Well, I think the single most effective thing the government could do, and I've been advocating this, is to say we are going to expand, by one means or another, our programme of capital investment to offset, and more than offset, the contraction which is produced by the austerity programme. I would say we are determined that £100 billion is going to be spent in the next 5-7 years on infrastructure, on housing, on other such things, roads, transport system. If they said that, and if the private sector saw that they were committed to expanding the market, then I think that would be a boost to confidence. I think the Chancellor's statement will fall a great deal, a long way short of that.
Mr. Bootle, just to get your final thoughts, what do you make of that? Do you agree capital investment to offset contraction? The government needs to go all out. They need to be decisive to give corporates and companies the confidence to spend again. But that's another unknown, isn't it?
Well, I do agree with that, but I guess I put more emphasis on the private sector component. I think that there would need to be some public sector involvement in this, clearly. What's really needed is commitment, determination, a plan, a vision to give confidence to the private sector to invest. I want to see more private sector money spent on infrastructure rather than government money. On your point about productivity, by the way, it wouldn't be my big worry. I mean, if Roger Lambert were to get his wish and productivity were to go up in the next few years, I'm afraid it would go up because firms would cut back on the workforce and unemployment would go up, which is the last thing we should want.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Is that not already happening?
There's a short-term and a long-term thing. The short-term priority is to get recovery. It's not efficiency. In the long term, of course, you need to improve your efficiency and your productivity, but you need to get employment up.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. Really good to have a nuanced discussion. Mr. Roger Bootle, Managing Director of Capital Economics, and of course Lord Robert Skidelsky, Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Warwick.